The vote was unanimous. That was the part that stayed with people afterward, not the outcome which had been expected, but the unanimity. 412 member civilizations of the Galactic Congress of Sovereign Peoples, 412 votes, not one abstention, not one dissent. The resolution passed at the 93rd session of the Congress, in the 2441st year of the Galactic Standard Calendar, on a day that the Congress's official record would later describe as administratively routine. It was not routines. The resolution stripped humanity of galactic citizenship. It revoked Earth's observer status, terminated all bilateral trade agreements operating under Congress sanction, suspended human access to the Congress's navigational database, which contained the charted routes through 600 years of interstellar exploration, and formally designated human space as a non-signatory zone, which was the Congress's polite language for a region whose inhabitants had no legal standing before any galactic institution and no recourse through any galactic mechanism. The grounds for the resolution were laid out in a document 11,000 words long, which the Congress's legal committee had spent 14 months preparing. The essential argument was that humanity had repeatedly, systematically, and without apparent remorse violated the Congress's foundational principle, that the rights of established civilizations took precedence over the expansion claims of younger ones, and that the mechanisms of the Congress existed to protect that precedence. In practice, this meant that humans had spent the previous century going places they were not supposed to go, building things they were not supposed to build, making agreements with species they were not supposed to talk to, and most critically, doing all of these things without asking permission from the bodies whose permission was required, because the humans had looked at those bodies and concluded, apparently, that permission was an inefficiency they could not afford. The Congress had warnings them 11 times. This was the response. The session hall was quiet when the vote was announced. 412 civilizations, represented by their designated diplomats, and the silence afterward had the quality of something that had been held in for a long time and was now, finally, released. In the gallery reserved for non-voting observers, the human delegation sat and listened to the results read aloud, civilization by civilization. The lead delegate was a woman named Constance Adami Park, who was 61 years old and had spent 30 years in interstellar diplomacy and who had known for the last 8 months that this vote was coming. She had spent those 8 months doing two things simultaneously, attempting through every available channel to prevent the outcome, and preparing with the methodical thoroughness that was her professional signature for what to do when prevention failed. She sat through the reading of all 412 votes. She took notes. When the presiding official formally announced the resolution as passed and final, she closed her notebook, capped her pen, and stood. Her aide, a 26-year-old named Marcus Webb, who was on his first major diplomatic posting and who had not slept properly in 6 weeks, leaned toward her and asked, very quietly, what they were going to do. Constance looked at him with the expression of someone who has already done the calculation and is now simply executing the result. "We're going to be very quiet," she said, "and very busy." To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what humanity had actually lost. Galactic citizenship in the Congress's framework was not a symbolic designation. It was infrastructure. It was access. It was the accumulated network of 2,000 years of interstellar political architecture, and like most infrastructure, its value was not fully apparent until it was gone. The navigational database was the most immediately obvious loss. Humanity had 600 years of its own charting, but the Congress's database contained routes through regions humanity had never reached, built on the observations of species who had been traveling the interstellar medium for millennia. Losing access to it didn't make the routes disappear. It made them invisible again. The trade agreements were more complicated. Dozens of species had been trading with humanity under Congress sanction, which meant the Congress's legal framework governed the transactions, dispute resolution, contract enforcement, standard weights and measures, currency conversion protocols. Without that framework, the agreements were technically still operational. In practice, they were exposed. Any party could walk away from any commitment and dare humanity to seek redress through institutions that no longer recognized them. Some did not, man. Why but some? The observer status revocation was the subtlest loss and in some ways the most consequential. Observers didn't vote, but observers attended. They heard debates before they became policy. They built relationships with delegates in the corridors of the session hall. They existed formally within the system, which meant they could be contacted, consulted, invited. Non-signatory status meant none of that. It meant that when the Congress's committees drafted new policy, there was no seat at the table from which a human voice could speak. Constance had spent a great deal of time thinking about that table. She had also spent a great deal of time thinking about what humanity had not lost. Because what humanity had not lost was everything it had built outside the Congress's framework. Every agreement made with species who did not require Congress sanction. Every route charted by human vessels in the century of expansion that had, in large part, precipitated the crisis. Every relationship built person to person, crew to crew, in the places that the Congress's records listed as underexplored or contested or simply ignored, because the species living there were too new or too small or too inconvenient to be worth formal incorporation. Humanity had not lost its ships. It had not lost its engineers. It had not lost the particular quality of problem-solving that had made it, in the Congress's view, a persistent nuisance, the instinct to look at a system, identify its pressure points, and find the places where something useful could be done. Constance, in the 8 months before the vote, had made a list of all of these things. It was a very long list. She reviewed it on the shuttle back to the human diplomatic station, while Marcus Webb sat across from her and tried not to look as frightened as he felt, and the star field moved past the viewport with the indifference of deep space. "Get some sleep," she told him. "I can't." "Then read this." She handed him the list. "We're going to need all of it." What followed was not what the Congress had anticipated. The Congress had anticipated one of two responses. The first, a period of diplomatic escalation, protests, counterproposals, appeals to individual member civilizations, attempts to build a coalition for reconsideration. The second, a period of economic distress as humanity felt the pressure of its new isolation and began making the concessions the Congress had been waiting a century for. Both of these responses would have been, from the Congress's perspective, manageable, predictable. The Congress was very good at managing predictable responses. It had 2,000 years of practice. What humanity did instead was go quiet. Not silent, humanity's communications didn't stop. Ships still moved. Signals still traveled. The stations and outposts and colony worlds of human space continued to function with the ordinary industry of a civilization that had a great deal to do. But the diplomatic channels, the formal exchanges, the scheduled consultations, the routine contact with Congress member civilizations slowed, and then slowed further, and then reduced to the minimum required by the terms of the bilateral agreements that were still technically in effect. In the Congress's monitoring divisions, this was noted with the particular attention that unexplained quietness always deserves. Analysts produced reports. Reports went to committee. Committee recommendations went to the relevant subsecretaries, who noted them and moved on to more immediate concerns. No one could identify what specifically humanity was doing, only that it was doing something. The first indication came from the Verath Cooperative, a mid-tier Congress member in the third spiral arm, who reported to the Congress's Trade Committee that their long-standing grain arrangement with the Human Agricultural Collective on New Providence Station had been renegotiated. New terms, new structure, significantly more favorable to the Verath at New Providence's suggestion. The new arrangement operated entirely outside Congress sanction, because New Providence had pointed out that Congress sanction came with Congress overhead, and the overhead, under current circumstances, was something New Providence preferred to avoid. The Verath's trade representative had agreed immediately. The Verath, who had a complicated relationship with Congress overhead themselves, had found this entirely reasonable. The second indication came from the Multary Continuity, who informed the Congress that they had accepted a proposal from a consortium of human engineering firms to assist with the extension of their atmospheric processing network. The Multary's representative noted, in the communication, that the proposal had been substantially better than the one submitted by the Congress-certified contractors who had held the Multary's infrastructure account for 40 years. The Congress's Infrastructure Committee acknowledged this communication and noted it for review. The third indication, and this was the one that moved the situation from noted to discussed at the session level, came from the Aetherian Assembly, who were not a mid-tier Congress member. The Aetherian Assembly were old. They had been Congress members since the 41st session, which was longer than most current members had been spacefaring civilizations. They had, over the course of 2,000 years, accumulated the particular status of a civilization that other civilizations wanted things from. The Aetherians' communication was brief, and by Aetherian standards, unusually direct. They had entered into a navigation-sharing agreement with the Human Exploration Consortium known as the Cartographers' Union. The agreement provided the Cartographers' Union with access to 3 centuries of Aetherian deep survey data in exchange for reciprocal access to human survey data from the previous century of expansion. Specifically, the regions that human vessels had reached that no Aetherian survey had previously mapped. The agreement did not require Congress sanction because the Aetherian Assembly had the right, under their original membership charter, to conduct bilateral exchanges of scientific data without committee review. No one had used that right in 400 years because no one had needed to. The Congress's framework had provided adequate mechanisms. The Aetherians' communication concluded, "We are notifying the Congress as a courtesy as the Charter requires. We expect no objection." There was no objection, there could not be an objection, the Charter was quite clear. But in the Congress's analysis division, the combination of the Verath grain arrangement, the Multary infrastructure project, and the Aetherian navigation exchange produced something that had not previously existed in anyone's documentation: a pattern. Marcus Webb, by the time he was 28, had acquired a reputation that he was not entirely sure he wanted. The reputation was this: that he understood in a specific and practically useful way the architecture of the Galactic Congress, not as a political system, which everyone in the diplomatic corps understood, but as a structure, with load-bearing elements and stress points and places where the weight was distributed unevenly, and the unevenness had been stable for so long that it had come to look like intentional design. He had not set out to acquire this reputation. He had set out, in the year after the citizenship vote, to do what Constance had asked of him, which was to read the list and think about all of it and identify the places where the things on the list could be made useful. The list had led him to the charters. The charters had led him to the original membership agreements. The original membership agreements had led him to a very large collection of documents that no one had read recently because they predated the current Congress architecture and were therefore assumed to be superseded. They were not superseded, they were merely dormant. The Congress of Sovereign Peoples had been built over 2,000 years through accretion, each new member, each new crisis, each new session adding layers of policy and procedure and precedent that gradually came to constitute the operating framework. But underneath those layers were the founding documents, and the founding documents had been written by civilizations that did not trust each other. And civilizations that do not trust each other write very specific agreements, with very specific protections that cannot be altered without the explicit consent of all parties who sign them. Many of those parties were no longer active Congress members. Some of them had dissolved or merged or been absorbed. Others had been suspended or expelled, for reasons that the historical record described with the particular vagueness that institutional records use when the reasons are not entirely flattering to the institution. But under galactic legal precedent, a field that Marcus was now spending 12 hours a day studying, which was not what he had expected his late 20s to look like, the rights established in founding documents did not expire with the signatories. They transferred. They became part of the legal inheritance of successor civilizations, or in cases where no clear successor existed, of any party who could demonstrate a legitimate claim. He brought his findings to Constance on a Tuesday, in her office at the Human Diplomatic Station, with 300 pages of annotated charter documents and the expression of someone who has found something significant and is not entirely sure whether to be pleased or alarmed. As she read for 2 hours, he sat across from her and waited. "The Karanathi," she said finally, "dissolved in session 1204. No successor designated. Their founding rights transferred to general holding under Congress administration, which means T. They are technically available to any party who can demonstrate a legitimate claim." She looked up. Marcus. The Karanathi were signatories to the original Navigation Freedom Charter. "Oh yes," which predates the navigational database access restrictions by 800 years. "Oh yes," and which establishes, in language that has never been amended because it predates the amendment procedures, that any party holding Karanathi succession rights has unconditional access to all navigational data generated by Congress member civilizations for the purposes of exploration in unsurveyed regions. He paused. The Congress's current restriction on our database access applies to the database as a membership benefit. The Karanathi Charter right applies to the data as a matter of foundational principle. They're two different legal frameworks. Constance set down the documents. How many other founding rights are in general holding? 37. The silence in the office had a different quality from the silence after the vote. That silence had been the sound of something ending. This silence was the sound of something beginning. The Congress's session 414 opened with a procedural agenda and became, within its first hour, something that no one on the planning committee had anticipated. The Vorath delegation, senior Congress members, reliably procedural, rarely agitated, submitted an emergency petition for clarification of rights in the matter of the Karanathi succession claim. 3 hours later, the Multary Continuity submitted a separate petition regarding the status of 7 infrastructure agreements currently in operation between Multary regional authorities and human engineering firms, specifically requesting that the Congress clarify whether these agreements were subject to the non-signatory restrictions or to the pre-accession bilateral rights established under the founding Commerce Protocols of Session 12. Before the day's session closed, 11 additional petitions had been submitted by 9 different member civilizations, all touching on variations of the same fundamental question. What precisely were the boundaries of the non-signatory designation when the party designated was simultaneously asserting rights under instruments that predated the designation framework? The Congress's legal committee convened an emergency session. What they found over the next 6 days was what Marcus Webb had found in his 300 pages of annotated documents, which was that the Congress's architecture, like all architecture built through accretion over centuries, had gaps. Not errors exactly, not oversights. Places where the layers did not quite align, where two legitimate frameworks existed in the same space, and had never been required to resolve their conflict because no one had ever been in a position to apply both simultaneously. Humanity was now in that position. The legal committee's preliminary report ran to 4,000 words and concluded, with the careful hedging of legal professionals confronting a situation their expertise had not prepared them for, that the situation was complex. The Congress's Secretary General, a Vorathi named Ishkeleth, who had held the position for 30 years and who prided herself on having seen every variant of galactic political maneuvering, read the preliminary report in her office, and then sat quietly for a period that her aide, who had worked with her for 12 years, recognized as the period in which she was revising her understanding of a situation. She had expected escalation. She had expected pressure. She had expected the things that civilizations with grievances did when the formal mechanisms failed them. Noise, coalition building, the theatrical display of injury that was the standard vocabulary of interstellar politics. Oh, she had not expected this. She had not expected a civilization that had been stripped of its standing to spend a quiet year reading old documents and making friends in the right places, and then, without a single public statement, present the Congress with a situation in which enforcing the non-signatory restrictions would require resolving legal contradictions that the Congress had not previously acknowledged, and could not resolve without reopening foundational instruments that had not been touched in 800 years. She sent a communication to the Human Diplomatic Station, addressed to Constance Adami Park. She requested a meeting. The meeting took place on neutral ground, a station in the outer rim of the first spiral arm, historically used for sensitive negotiations, with a reputation for discretion that 2,000 years of use had done nothing to diminish. Ishkeleth brought her chief legal advisor and her senior policy director. Constance brought Marcus Webb and a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who had spent 20 years as humanity's foremost expert on galactic institutional law and who had spent the last year serving as the primary architect of the strategy that was now in operation. The meeting was scheduled for 3 hours. It lasted 9. Ishkeleth was not accustomed to being in a negotiating position that she had not established herself. She was also, it must be said, a being of genuine intelligence who understood with clarity when a situation had moved beyond the point where the usual tools were effective. She laid out the Congress's position with precision. The non-signatory resolution was legitimate, legally sound, and represented the clear consensus of the membership. The Congress had no procedural basis for reversing it, absent a new vote which required a supermajority that was not currently available. These were facts. Constance acknowledged all of this. She did not dispute the legitimacy of the resolution. She did not argue that the vote had been improper. She made instead a different argument. The argument was this: the situation the Congress now faced was not a dispute about whether the resolution was legitimate. It was a dispute about what the resolution actually governed, because the resolution had been drafted within a framework that did not account for the pre-accession rights that were now in play. Resolving that question would require the Congress to examine instruments that had not been examined in centuries. That examination would take years. During those years, the practical effect of the non-signatory designation would continue to be eroded by every bilateral arrangement, every charter claim, every founding right that human diplomatic and legal teams had spent the past year identifying and activating. "We are not asking for the resolution to be reversed," Constance said. "We are asking whether the Congress is interested in a negotiated framework that resolves the underlying questions without requiring the legal examination we just described." Ishkeleth was quiet for a long moment. What kind of framework? Constance placed a document on the table. It was 40 pages long. It had taken 9 months to write, and the writing had involved every human legal, diplomatic, and political mind that Constance could recruit. And it was, in Dr. Annan's private assessment, the most carefully constructed proposal she had seen in 30 years of institutional law. It proposed a new category of Congress membership, not full citizenship, not observer status, not the non-signatory designation. A fourth category, which the document called associated sovereign, with a specific set of rights and obligations that addressed every concern that had appeared in the Congress's 11 warning letters, while preserving the navigational access, the bilateral agreement framework, and the foundational charter rights that humanity had spent the past year activating. It was, in other words, a proposal for the Congress to give humanity something that looked like a concession, but was, in practice, more than humanity had possessed before the vote. Ishkeleth read the 40 pages. Her legal advisor read them simultaneously, annotating with the rapid efficiency of someone who has learned to absorb a great deal of text quickly and identify the important questions. The important question which both of them arrived at independently was this: could the Congress afford not to accept? Because the alternative, the legal examination, the years of process, the reopening of foundational instruments, was not merely inconvenient. It was the kind of institutional disruption that in 2,000 years of galactic history had twice come close to dissolving the Congress entirely. And at the end of that process, if the legal questions resolved in humanity's favor, humanity would have everything in the proposal and more. And the legal questions might very well resolve in humanity's favor. Dr. Anand had done the analysis. She had been very thorough. This took you a year, Ishkeleth said finally. It was not quite a question. We had time to prepare, Constance said. You gave us the timeline. Another silence. Then, from Ishkeleth, something that was not quite a smile but was the Vorathi equivalent, a specific position of facial structures that indicated the recognition of something that, in different circumstances, might have been appreciated. The Karanathi claim, she said, the database access. You could have raised this immediately after the vote. Oh yes. Why didn't you? Constance considered the question. It was a fair one. Because raising it immediately would have looked like escalation, she said. And we needed the Congress to believe for a year that we had accepted the outcome. That belief gave us time. And it gave you, she paused, choosing the word carefully, an experience of what it looked like when humanity went quiet. Ishkeleth was quiet for a moment. We found it more unsettling than the noise. As I know, the Associated Sovereign Framework was ratified at the Congress's 415th sess. Signed by a vote of 389 to 23. The 23 dissenting votes came from civilizations who felt the framework was too generous. The 389 votes in favor came from civilizations who had reached a variety of conclusions, that the framework was the best available option, that the alternative was worse, that the bilateral arrangements they had already established with humanity were worth protecting, or simply that a resolution was preferable to continued ambiguity. The Aetherian Assembly voted in favor, and the Aetherian representative noted publicly that the navigation-sharing agreement with the Cartographers' Union had produced, in the preceding year, more useful survey data than the previous decade of Congress-certified exploration projects combined. The Varath Cooperative voted in favor, and their representative did not make a public statement, but was observed to shake Constance Adami Park's hand with an enthusiasm that the session hall noted and did not quite know what to do with. The Moultrie Continuity voted in favor, and separately, their infrastructure committee signed a 15-year extension with the Human Engineering Consortium, which was not a diplomatic matter and therefore required no comment. Back on Earth, in the ordinary way that news travels when people are waiting for it, the ratification was received. There were celebrations in some places. In others, the reaction was quieter, the particular relief of people who had spent a year living in uncertainty and were now incrementally on the other side of it. Policy analysts wrote pieces about the strategic architecture of the response. Legal scholars published papers about the Karanathi succession claim and the general holding provisions, and what the entire episode revealed about the vulnerabilities of accretion-based institutional design. Marcus Webb did not read most of these pieces because he was 30 years old and in a new posting, the first human diplomatic attaché to the Aetherian Assembly under the Associated Sovereign Framework, and he had a great deal of work to do. He was good at it. He had always been good at finding the places in a structure where something useful could be done. Constance had identified this quality in him in the first 6 weeks of the citizenship crisis and had made decisions accordingly, and she had not been wrong. He had one conversation with Ishkeleth, who had in the new framework a formal liaison role with the associated sovereign member civilizations, early in his Aetherian posting. It was a brief exchange, corridor rather than conference room, the kind of conversation that official records do not capture. Ishkeleth asked him, with the directness that had characterized her conduct throughout the entire episode, how humanity had known that the strategy would work. Marcus thought about Constance, and the list, and the 300 pages of annotated charter documents, and the 9 months of drafting, and the year of going quiet. "We didn't," he said. "We knew what we had and we knew what we needed and we looked for the path between them. That's usually all you can do." Ishkeleth considered this. "Your civilization has a specific quality," she said. "I am having difficulty identifying the correct term." "We get told that a lot." "It is not stubbornness. I have encountered stubbornness. This is different. It is." She paused, searching the Vorathi lexicon for something that wasn't quite there. "It is the quality of a being that looks at an obstacle and begins immediately calculating angles." Marcus nodded. "We call it being difficult." "You should call it something more complimentary." "The people who experience it from the other side generally disagree." The Galactic Congress's 416th session opened with a procedural agenda and was, by all available records, administratively routine. In the gallery, the human diplomatic delegation sat in seats that now had small plaques beside them. Associated Sovereign UEDC and Constance Adami Park had her notebook open and her pen uncapped, and she was listening to a subcommittee report about agricultural standards with the same total attention she brought to everything. Because total attention was the tool, and the tool did not know the difference between the important work and the routine work, and that was precisely the point. 2 rows behind her, a young attaché from the newest human posting, the Molturi Infrastructure Liaison Office, was reading the session's agenda with the particular expression of someone who is beginning to understand that the agenda is not the point. The point is what the agenda doesn't include, and what the agenda doesn't include is everything that is currently being built quietly in the margins. The Congress was 412 civilizations and 2,000 years of accumulated architecture and the weight of all of that history, and it was ours. Oh, underneath all of that, a structure, with load-bearing elements and pressure points and places where things could be done. Humanity had been removed from the structure. And then it had spent a year reading the blueprints. Out in the Corinth's drift, in the approach corridors that had been the subject of a different legal argument entirely, human exploration vessels were moving outbound, past the charted regions, into the survey data that the Aetherian Exchange had opened, into the places that the galactic map still marked as unknown. They were going places they had not been before, and they were noting what they found, and they were making relationships with the species they encountered there. And the framework they were operating under was new, and the framework was partly of their own construction, and it was not perfect. Nothing built under pressure ever is, but it was theirs. The Congress noted their movement in the monitoring reports. The monitoring reports went to committee. No one called it a problem. Well, not yet. But in the analysis division, a young Vorathi researcher who had been assigned to the Human Situation Monitoring Brief had begun, in his own time, to read the original founding charters of the civilizations that human vessels were currently making contact with. Just to understand the architecture, just to see where the weight was distributed. He told his supervisor when she noticed the stack of documents on his desk that he was being proactive. She looked at the documents and then at him with an expression that he could not quite interpret. "Be careful," she said, "what you learn to see." She was right, but the researcher kept reading because he was 32 years old and he had been watching humanity for 18 months, and he had developed the private conviction that the most useful thing a person could do in any given situation was understand it more precisely than anyone else. He did not know yet where that conviction came from. Well, he would figure it out.